Hello, this is Stuart Bray with a replay of the presentation that I gave at the London IMATS in June 2013. This was a presentation about some alternative approaches to some sculpting techniques, and it was a fun thing to do, and hopefully this video will act as to refresh the memories of people who were there and to fill you in if you weren't able to make it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to look at is some instant coffee grounds. I'm sure you've all seen this stuff. Basically, it is just pure, instant coffee from any kind of store. It doesn't really matter what it is. The best thing, I guess, is to try and get the biggest granules you can. If you can get the granules to be big, some tend to be finer and smaller than others, but if you can get bigger granules, then this will be a little bit more effective. And basically, what I did was I started with a life cast, and I marked out around the face where I wanted some spots to be. So if you were doing like zits or some kind of diseasey thing, you could mark out where you would like the zits to be. And I used a piece of plastic to mark the outlines of the lips and the nose, so that I knew, the shape of this and where these pieces would crash into the nose and the mouth. And I transferred that shape onto a board so that I could basically make the zits using these coffee granules. But I wanted it to be sure that the mold I made would fit within the confines between the nose and the mouth, so that they were the right shape. So by putting the pattern on the board, I could just mark out where the lips and the nose were, and then arrange my coffee granules like this to kind of give a kind of a random effect. And then what you do is you put like a wet tissue, this is just some tissue that's been soaked in water, next to the granules, and then cover them with a plastic Tupperware box like this. It's just a plastic lunchbox thing, and you just leave that overnight. I mean, if you leave it a couple of hours, it'll probably start to work, but if you leave it overnight, what happens is the moisture that was in the tissue migrates across to the dry granules, and they actually do something like this. They actually absorb the moisture and they become sort of swollen and rounded off, and they create these really nice natural looking rounded shiny globules, which if you were to sculpt these would take quite a bit of time, because you'd have to get them perfect and rounded and blended in, whereas these could be scattered, and you could create a very large area of diseasey kind of spots very quickly just by scattering these granules around and then just letting the moisture soak in like this. Obviously, once I made these shapes, what I did was I left them open without any moisture around, let them dry for another day. So they were actually the same shape, but now they were hardened. And then I made a quick silicone mold of them like this. And this could be then filled with either silicone or Pro Bonder or something to make a little transfer appliance. And it's just a nice way, like I say, of making a very random, sort of natural looking, sort of broken up pattern of spots or veins or, any kind of diseasey weirdness. It's quite nice to have that kind of randomness about it, rather than deliberately sculpting and placing each one. It's a bit more kind of natural looking. The other way you could do it is to use Plastiline. I've got some Plastiline, which is an oil-based clay, and basically scrape it through a surf form blade, which is kind of like a cheese grater. If you've not seen a surf form before, it looks like one of these. You may know it as a rasp, but basically it's a tool from a hardware store, and you can use it to shave, Plastiline, which is like a wax, into little bits like this. And I did basically the same thing with this. I made some little bits, and I popped them on a board and just kind of moved them around with a brush until I was happy with the position. I didn't spend a lot of time doing this. This was just basically, to create, a random patch without deliberately creating patterns or, a series of lines or anything like that. You just want a random dispersion of blobs. And then what I used, once I'd done my blobs, I used a blowtorch, a little soldering torch like this. They look like this. They're used obviously for soldering, but you can also find a lot of kitchen shops do like a creme brulee torch for caramelizing the top of a creme brulee. It's basically like a little butane torch, and it's quite nice because you can use it to just melt ever so gently the blobs. And when you melt them, they go like this, they sort of round off and soften, and then you can allow them to cool. And then you can do various things, like I raked over the top with a small rake tool to kind of shave some texture into them. Or you could even heat them up gently with a hairdryer and then use you know, like a coarse stipple sponge through some cling film or saran wrap or something to kind of get some kind of mole type texture that you would get on like an old mole or something, or a wart. And again, the reason we're doing these techniques is that you can do a very large area and a lot of these very quickly because you're doing them as a process rather than as individual little sculpts. So this whole thing could be done in about 5 or 10 minutes. Whereas if you were to sculpt them manually, obviously it would take you a lot longer because you'd have to shave down and refine and blend out the edges of each one. The other thing we're going to do is to mix up a little bit of clay slip. Now, if you're familiar with clay slip, it's basically water mixed with clay, and it's used a lot in pottery to kind of create glazes and like thinner versions of clay. Well, we can do the same kind of thing using naphtha or lighter fluid and mixing little blobs of plastiline. And if you put little blobs of plastiline in a cup that is solvent proof so that the solvent doesn't damage the cup, so use either glass or a plastic that's approved for kind of solvent use. You put the blobs in like this and then just cover them with lighter fluid, and then I left them covered, you know, put like a lid on top and leave it for sort of 15 to 20 minutes. And if you leave it for that time, then you open it up, give it a stir. The reason I cover it obviously is to reduce any sort of danger of hazards, you know, because it's a flammable liquid, but it also reduces the evaporation which can happen with it. And if you give it a stir, it basically, you can turn it into like a slippery kind of thin runny clay liquid, which you can then brush on over the top like this. And then you brush most of it off with a clean brush and you end up with this kind of thing, which is a much more softened, refined kind of finish, very, very gentle kind of blobby finish. And this is great for a collection of moles or zits or blisters if you're doing like an outbreak of disease like smallpox or something. This kind of blistered kind of pattern, it's a very quick way of creating you know, the shape. And then once you've done this, what you would do is leave it out for, you know, a few hours to let the solvent completely evaporate off, and then make a mold of it. And this is actually a piece that I made using this technique. It's exactly the same piece that you saw sculpted. So this is a silicone and cat plastic piece. You could instead obviously fill the mold that you make with this, assuming you make a silicone mold. You could fill it with Pro Bondo or something. That works very well too. If you are going to make pieces from flat molds, incidentally, the way that I sort of fill them is to you can either airbrush or you can paint in with a paintbrush your thin layers of cat plastic, and then once the cat plastic has completely evaporated, or the solvents in the cat plastic have evaporated, you're left with a, you know, a thin film of cat plastic inside the mold. Then you put your silicone inside, scrape the back clean, and then you can fill that obviously with silicone of your choice, the colour that matches the skin that you're going to be applying it to. And then once you've done that and that's completely cured, you can then put a layer of cat plastic on the back too. So you end up basically encapsulating the appliance in a material which is obviously cat plastic, which means you can actually glue it and paint it, because the glue and the makeup will stick to the cat plastic in a way that it wouldn't necessarily stick to the silicone, because as I'm sure you're aware, one of the beautiful things about silicone is that not much sticks to it. And that is, after all, why we make molds out of it. But that's a bit of a pain if you're trying to then stick silicone to the skin. So by putting a membrane on the outside surfaces of the silicone, you're protecting the soft silicone, which is very sticky, and you're also providing a surface which will accommodate both glue and makeup, making it more usable. Another technique for creating some textures is I basically cast out from a box lid. I got a box lid, one of these really useful boxes from the Really Useful Box Company, I believe they're called, and I used the lid, and basically I filled it with you know, some silicone to make a very thin sheet of silicone. And then what I did was I then filled the silicone with a thin layer of plaster, and I let the plaster almost set, and then I basically put a load of things underneath it. So I put like nuts, bolts, coins, batteries, whatever underneath to basically create a lump underneath the surface before it completely set. And then you get these really interesting textures with the plaster as it's setting. As you move it, it kind of crinkles up and folds, and the more it sets, the harder it becomes, and it starts breaking up. So the top two pictures here, as I moved the corners when it was very, very soft, when it hadn't quite gone off, and then the one underneath, you can see the lines a lot harder, a lot crisper, and that was because I bent them up when it was nearly set. So you ended up with a kind of different effect. And basically by creating these cracked up effects which again you didn't do deliberately. Rather, they don't look deliberate, they look kind of random and natural. You create these nice little cracked kind of ceramic textures, and basically what I did was I made a quick silicone mold of it. You can see here's the silicone mold pulled off of it, and then I filled it with molten plastiline. So I melted some oil-based clay, some plastiline, and brushed it onto the inside like this. If you're going to melt plastiline, incidentally, you can either use a saucepan on a very low heat and stay with it, because otherwise you could burn it and it could melt and do all sorts of horrible things, or you could use a crock pot like the slow cooker on the right, which is nice and safe. You kind of plug it in, you can have it on a low setting and just leave it, but again stay with it, and you can just leave it to melt gently, and that gives you a nice molten plastiline, which you can then brush into your mold. So once it's molten, like I say, you can paint it in, and you allow it to cool for a couple of hours. Then once it's cool, you can peel it out, and you basically have this, which is an exact copy of the thing that you created in plaster, but now it's in plastiline. So it's in a material that you can actually manipulate and change. And so what I did was I cut out a couple of choice areas that I liked, and then blended the edges out like this to create an appliance that had a nice blended edge that would move, merge into the skin. But the actual guts on the inside, all those kind of cool textures and wrinkles, they were created by process rather than skill. So they're very natural looking, and they look like cracked surface because that's exactly what they are, and it's just a way of harvesting three-dimensional textures in the same way that you might take a photograph of something you like. Here you've actually got its topography, its three-dimensional surface captured. And I did a few others that were quite nice, like these guys here. I like these two. And I just want to look at this. This is a couple of things we did for Stardust. Here you can see this is a burn makeup that we did, and what I wanted to do was get some really nice thin peeled skin effects, and I thought rather than actually sculpting these little thin edges, I thought I'd actually try and fabricate them by putting latex on and then peeling the latex back when it had dried to create that kind of rolled edge that you often get with very thin skin that's peeled back. These pieces were cast out on foam latex, incidentally, which is why I'm using latex. I wouldn't want to use latex if the piece was going to be made in silicone, because you get inhibition issues with silicone latex, but this worked rather well, like I say, because had I spent time sculpting it, it would look the same, whereas this took sort of like 5 minutes to do this, and it's very fine little detail, and it came out in the piece quite nicely. This was a makeup from Mindhunters. This was something I did at Dave White's a while back, and again we have this kind of cracking skin thing, and this was actually sculpted. So this is an example of the kind of makeup where you would actually need to sculpt kind of a cracking skin effect, and it's quite nice to think, if you had to do the whole body or something and you didn't have a lot of time, then you could sort of fabricate the textures using a process rather than laboriously sculpting each one. And what's great about these techniques is even if you can sculpt, even if you can't sculpt, you can still get something quite interesting. But if you can sculpt, obviously, you can then take the things you've created through the processes like the cracking of plaster and then modify them and tweak them and work with them so that they sort of, the lion's share of the texture and the form is created incidentally by process, but then you've actually been able to sort of enhance it and blend it into the skin where you need to. This was another one. This was from a movie called Below, and there was a little scene of a kind of a ghost captain coming back, and again they wanted some kind of cracked, sort of fractured skin effect, and we kind of sculpted this, again using conventional methods, but again it took more time because of it, and we certainly could have used that process to create textures by cracking plaster. We could have created a lot of different textures quite quickly and use them for designs and for reference when sculpting these things. This is a cheese sauce that I made a while back, and I made a cheese sauce. We used a lot of it. We had some left over, got put in the refrigerator in a plastic tub, and it was left for a couple of weeks. Completely forgot about it. Got buried under other food, and then eventually I found it, pulled it out and opened it up and found this, and before I threw it away I noticed, obviously because of the really cool textures that it had, I had to take some photographs of it. Unfortunately, this was a while back. I didn't have the presence of mind to make a mold of this because it didn't occur to me at the time, but I did take some photographs, but you can see these really kind of intricate patterns. You know, if you were going to do like some kind of alien brain or something, you know, very neat little texture there. Again, not sculpted by hand. This is just what has happened to it. It's a very natural, realistic thing because it happened naturally. But you can see these really complex shapes, how the things knitted into each other, and it's just the mathematics of whatever surface contraction and mold growth have led to. So that would have been a really neat thing to get a texture of. It certainly would have been a really nice design element, even if you were just going to use it as a starting point. So what I did was, instead of fabricating this again, what I did was I found some quiche in the supermarket, and I literally took a mold of the quiche and made a plastiline skin of it like this, and then, you know, cut a section out and blended the edges off to create this piece, which, you know, again could be some kind of weird alien skin or the start of some kind of peculiar disease, or you could even, you know, make it into some kind of blistery effect. But what I've done here is I've just surrounded it with you know, some plastiline and blended it out into the skin, as if the edge of the piece is the healthy skin, and then it suddenly turns into this sort of mottled, wobbly kind of baggy skin thing. So that was a fun thing to do using quiche. And this is the silicone piece made from it. Now, I've used silicone and cling film before. This picture here is some Sculpt gel, which is a paste that you mix up. It's a silicone paste, and you mix it up when you need it, and you put it on the skin, and you can tool it into shape. And it's made by Mould Life. It's a very nice material for creating effects directly on the skin. So if you don't have any molds and everything, you know, you can work directly on the skin to create this thing. If you're interested in Sculpt gel and stuff, then if you click on the link underneath, you'll be taken to a page with some more information on that. But Sculpt gel is a really nice material, and like I say, you can do all kinds of different things with it. And this is like a kind of a weird burn blister thing. And what I did was I put some Sculpt gel on the skin, which, like I say, it's quite a thick paste. You put it on the skin, model it roughly to where you want it to be, and then I covered it with some cling film, and basically the cling film crinkles up and creates these cool little lines and textures, and you can move it around until you're happy with the shapes, and then you let it go off, you let it cure, which takes about 5 or 10 minutes, and then when it's cured you peel the cling film off, and you're left with these really funky little textures, which if you were to sculpt freehand would take a great deal longer. So I did basically the same thing on a board. I put some thickened silicone on there. You can use pretty much anything that's thick, you know, but the silicone's nice because it kind of it's resistant, and I can make it as thick as I need it to be. So I put some silicone on the board, and then I covered it with some cling film, like a thin plastic food wrap, and then moved it around with, you know, a brush and some tools to create these interesting little textures and folds and things. And then this is obviously I'm in a mold, and then got a plastiline out of it, and this is the plastiline that came out. And I did the same thing again. I took a couple of choice shapes, and then, you know, kind of sculpted them and blended the edges out and made them into nice little pieces like this. Something I also did for a TV show called Walking the Dead, there were these there was a corpse that had been soaked in water, you know, he'd been found in a reservoir, and there was a lot of wrinkling of skin obviously on the hands and feet, so we had to create this kind of wrinkled skin effects. And these are reference pictures that would sort of, you know, clue us into what kind of effect they wanted, and I didn't really have time to sculpt all of these. So what we did was we actually mixed up some silicone paste and literally sculpted them using cling film over the top, and just moved them around until we got the right kind of textures, and then molded them to make pieces, which meant we could basically do 2 hands and 2 feet quite quickly. I think we did them in like in a day or afternoon or something. It wasn't long at all, whereas if you were to sculpt them conventionally it would take an awful long time. And this is the foot appliance that this is what it looked like, and this is the hand appliance. As you can see, it was quite effective at creating that wrinkled up skin texture. And like I say, rather than sculpting every single fold, you know, using traditional techniques, we got 90% of the work done by using this process. Just bearing in mind to sort of nudge it into the right shapes of the hand and feet, you can actually, you know, like I say, do this thing quite realistically without a huge amount of effort. Another thing which we did, I thought would be quite fun, is to create a zombie bite using an apple. Now it occurred to me that a lot of fruit and foods would break down and go mouldy when they're left out. So I thought I would try something with an apple, which was something I was prepared to bite. I'm aware that biting meat would probably create some interesting textures, but I'm reliably informed a lot of the fibres get stuck in your teeth, so I tried with an apple instead. So I got an apple, I bit into it, and I left it a couple of weeks, and this was the result. So you get this kind of mouldy apple thing. And basically what I did was I took a silicone off of it, and here's a plaster out of that silicone, and it's quite interesting to look at it, and you can see all the little fine lines and wrinkles and folds in it. And like I say, rather than these being sculpted, this is just what happened to the skin on the apple once the the stuff inside had broken down and the skin became loose and kind of saggy. That's the kind of texture you get. So I did like I did before. I took a quick silicone mold. Here I'm using a life casting silicone called Lifeform. And the reason I'm using this is because it goes off really quickly. I can put that in there, and in 5 or 10 minutes I can peel it straight off. And once I've got my mold, I pinned it onto a board to flatten it out. So this is the reverse of the apple bite. And then I painted in my molten plastiline again. And then once that was done, I let that cool, peel it out, and this, as you can see, is the effect. So I've got my bite effect, all these wrinkles around there, and again, none of these wrinkles have been sculpted by hand. They're just the natural effect of the apple breaking down and being moldy. And then once the piece has been sort of teased out, I did add some texture to blend the edges in, but there you go, you got this kind of it kind of looks like a zombie Mike from Monsters Inc., but it's this nice little thing, and again, not a laborious process at all, quite a quick little technique, a nice way of doing the wrinkly kind of skin effects. Another technique which is quite cool is to use some gelatine to create some like burn effects. Now the thing about gelatine is it's very cheap, and it's reusable as well. So what I did here was to melt some gelatine down and then just move it around on a board and create some textures like this. And basically you put the gelatine, you melt it in a microwave, and then put a spoonful of it on a hard sort of work surface like a piece of board or something, and just keep moving it around. And as it cools down, obviously it starts stringing like cheese on a pizza, and you can actually start tooling it around to create some textures. If you want to, you can gently reheat it with a blowtorch or like a hot paint stripping gun, which is like it's kind of like a hairdryer, but it gets a lot hotter, and that's quite nice. You can gently heat the gelatine, even once you've applied it onto the board, and just reconstitute it so it becomes molten again, and then move it around until you get some interesting shapes and textures. And again, they're created sort of randomly. You are in control of it to a degree, but there's quite a lot of it that you can't control, so you end up with these very nice and sort of happy accidents. And again, you just sort of take a mold of it and then get sections out that you like. So here is a mold of the final thing, or a piece made from the mold of the final thing, and there's lots of little interesting little areas which you could use to create nice burn effects. And again, the whole thing, this took about 5 minutes to sculpt all of this, whereas if I was doing it conventionally, it could take you a couple of days. So it's quite a nice way of doing things very quickly, especially if you've got a large area to cover, like the back or something like that, or half a body. You need some kind of burn quickly. It's a nice way of doing that. And this was a burn that we did using gelatine. Basically the same process. I sculpted the burn up on a board, making sure that the shape of the overall piece was correct to fit the back of a hand, and then we made a quick mold of it, and then cast out the piece in silicone. So you have all the benefits and shapes and the natural sort of randomness of the gelatine, but all the benefits of the silicone in that the edges blended in okay. If you ignore the wrist area, all the edges blended in okay, and have the durability and the strength of the silicone. Another thing which is kind of cool is to actually create some silicone blocks. I got a tile, and I textured it and then made a mold of the tile, just a ceramic tile, the kind of tile you'd put in a bathroom or something. And then I basically created slabs of silicone. So I've got my slab of silicone, and the good thing about silicone is you can start to then damage it. I did something similar to this in Mindhunters, where we had some silicone sheets, and I would actually sort of attack it with a knife or a hammer, screwdriver, whatever, and just kind of stab it as if it was skin to create these kind of damage areas. And this is the kind of thing you can do with this soft silicone. You can actually rip into it and cause imperfections in the surface as if it was skin. So you attack it in a way that real skin would be attacked. You're not thinking about it, you're not being too deliberate about it, but you actually create damage and imperfections in the surface. And then again, you could either make molds of these or use them as reference when you're sculpting. So rather than imagine what a cut might look like, get a silicone sheet like this and stab it 50 times, or slash it and attack it, and just see what kinds of shapes the surface of the skin makes when it has been damaged and stabbed and ripped. And you can actually then use that to inform your sculpting when you're sculpting it longhand. And there we go. That takes care of the presentation. I hope you found it of interest if you're into that sort of thing. And if you do have any questions, please do drop me a line. My email address is mail@learnprostheticmakeup.com. And thanks for listening.